very great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Colin Mason, who works for SRUC Vet Services. He is a vet himself and he runs the Premium Cattle Health Scheme, and he's going to talk to us today about disease investigation. So, with no more ado.
Thank you very much, Maggie. Good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be here, and thanks very much again to the Kellys for the invitation to come today. I've come down from South West Scotland, where the sun's actually shining all day. When I left this morning, it was a beautiful day. Really I'm here to talk about what we do with the Premium Cattle Health Scheme, which is one of the checks accredited health schemes in the UK, and probably start also by acknowledging the progress that's been made with all the different beef breed societies over the last 10 years. Increasingly, health status has been talked about more and more when cattle are being traded, when you're buying replacement bulls, when you're buying replacement heifers, and the beef industry is a good way further forward the dairy industry is on this, which is great to see. We would always see any of the health schemes as a partnership between the farmer themselves, their vet, and ourselves as one of the people that runs the schemes. And the aim really is to overall improve the health status of individual herds, and potentially also the national herd, and be able to demonstrate that those health changes and those health benefits can be passed on if animals are sold and traded. So what I want to talk about this afternoon now, we moved on. What I want to talk about this afternoon is one of the diseases that we deal with quite a lot, which is Johne's disease. And let me mention a little bit about what we see clinically on farms and how it can affect the bottom line of a beef suckler herd, whether that's a pedigree herd or a commercial herd, and some of the approaches to control for this disease in terms of how to manage it. So some of the clinical signs that we see with this disease are really a diarrhea, a scour that doesn't respond to treatment, and the animals usually lose weight over a period of time in spite of having a really, really good appetite. So you get a cow that progressively loses weight or have diarrhea, and that cow's only going one way if she continues to develop in that way. So fertility is another thing that goes hand in hand with that, and we often see fertility problems in these cows before they actually develop the full-blown weight loss. So if we're always considering overall conception rates in suckler herds, the number of barren cows that you might see towards the end of the breeding period, then in herds with a high degree of Johne's present, then we quite often find that these cows that end up not being in calf are the ones that are developing their Johne's disease. One of the things that we sometimes see at springtime as well with these herds is that we know, particularly from the dairy situation, that a Johne's infected cow will produce less milk and her colostrum quality will be reduced. So one of the ways that can show up in the suckler herd is more calf health issues in the first few weeks of life. And potentially when you get to weaning as well, if you have some calves that are slightly smaller than others and have no real obvious reason for that, it might be down to poorer milk production by the cow and supplying less nutrition over the lifetime of that calf before it was weaned. So poor milk yield with effects on calf growth rates is another factor there as well. The other one that is a significant problem sometimes, hopefully less so now, as more and more bulls that are traded actually come with a Johne's status, is weight loss in bulls fairly early on in their lives. So we would expect a bull to work for 4, 5, 6 seasons, depending on how it gets on. And these are bulls that might break down earlier than that in their lives. They start to lose weight, they lose their fertility, and if this is a bull that you spent a significant chunk of money on, then it's not going to be much use as a breeding animal on your farm. So this is one of the areas where it really can hit in the pocket. So loss of high value bulls early in productive life. Now the disease itself is quite a complicated one. And you can see maybe from the picture here that there's actually 2 pieces of intestine from an animal here. There's one at the bottom here that's nice and smooth, and the other one at the top here is all thickened and roughened. And this is the one from an animal that's got Johne's disease. And what we find is that if the lining of your intestine is all thickened like that, you just can't absorb the nutrients from the diet as well as possible. So a lot of these nutrients go firing through the gut, come out the other end, and the animal scours. And that's what we see in the animal itself with these animals that are infected. So a thickening of the gut wall, failure to absorb the products of digestion. They keep eating, but they can't absorb it, and that's why they lose weight and they scour. The dynamics of infection within the herd as well are also quite complicated in that it's spread in the feces. It can also be spread in milk and colostrum, so from the dam to the calf, and also it can be spread actually before the calf is even born. So it can spread to a developing fetus if the cow herself is infected. So these are all routes of transmission. There are also potential routes of transmission in the environment as well. So we do see potentially some wildlife sources, so rabbits, deer can also carry the infection. But by far and away the biggest way that this is spread is through the feces of infected cattle passing out into the environment and infecting calves. We think that these calves are probably infected in the first few days of life. So they're picking up the infection very, very early on, probably in the first days or weeks after they're born. And the difficulty with this disease, and it's a difficult one for any farmer, is this that they pick the disease up very, very early, and then probably the peak age for them developing clinical effects of the disease is probably about 4 or 5 years old. So you've got this very, very long lag period between when the infection is picked up and when they actually go down with the disease itself. And as a result of that, what we tend to find in any herd that has the disease is that you have this kind of iceberg effect. So you've got the sea here and the animals that are on top of the iceberg and are poking out of the water are the clinically affected animals that are the ones that you can see. Below the sea, however, there is a sort of a bigger number of animals that might be developing the disease within a herd. And these will be clinically normal at this stage. They're infected because they picked up the disease as a baby calf, but then they're going on to eventually develop the disease and become clinical if they're allowed to. And it's this area here, if we can pick the disease up at this stage, then we can hopefully stop the development of the disease within the herd over time. So that's how it tends to work. So some of the issues for any herd, whether it's a pedigree beef herd or whether it's a commercial beef herd, is do I have this disease in my herd, yes or no? How do I manage it if I'm in this situation, and what can I do? Issues for homebred replacements. If you're breeding your own homebred replacements, then there are potential concerns because unless you know which animals are infected and which animals aren't, we could be amplifying this disease in your herd. And then there's also issues for sourcing replacement stock, whether that be bulls or heifers, is being able to trade these animals and know that they are low risk, or at least know what the risk status is, so that you can buy animals knowing what you're potentially taking on. So we would always say for purchase stock, the best way to go now is to know the disease status of the herd that you're buying these animals from. It's quite difficult to define the individual status of an individual animal, so we tend to approach this disease from a herd perspective. So the herd would be given a risk status for whether it is a risk level 1 herd, which is a low risk herd, right the way through to a risk level 5, which is a higher risk herd. And there are different stages, levels 2, 3, 4 and 5 in between, which give you as a buyer or as a seller some recognition for what the potential risk is of having Johne's disease in these herd and what the animal could bring with you. So if there's any particular questions on that, either towards the end of the talk or afterwards, we'll be at the stand and we can discuss these things through with you. What we would always suggest if buying a bull or heifers and bringing them home is that they're quarantined and that they're tested in quarantine. And there's a fairly quick, simple test that can be done on the dung, which can show whether the organism is present or not. And that's something that can be done just to try and assess the risk of these animals whilst they're still in quarantine and not causing a problem for the rest of the herd. And we would also suggest that any animals that are bought, and this is one of the rules of the health schemes, that they're tested every year subsequently to show that they are staying negative and everything is all right. So whilst purchase stock for any disease in any farm situation will always pose a risk, there are ways of trying to manage these risks and also minimise these risks as much as possible. So, do I have Johne's disease in my herd? Here's some of the questions you've got to think about, and certainly it's always worthwhile following up any individual clinical cases that might be suspicious. So if you have cows that have got a non-responsive scour, they're not responding to treatment, or they're suffering from significant weight loss, then these are the sorts of animals to follow up with your vet and consider whether these might be Johne's clinical cases and the animals at the tip of the iceberg, if you like. And also we've got to get it into context as well, and we've got to consider other possible reasons why these animals might be ill-thriven. So, you know, one of the common ones in the west part of the country would be liver fluke, for example, but there's plenty of other reasons why an animal might be thin as well as, or scouring as well as Johne's disease itself. I think for any herd, pedigree or commercial, it's also worthwhile critically assessing herd performance and risk and considering what are your cull cow rates and your barren cow rates, and does that relate to body condition, and could this relate back to a risk of Johne's disease in your herd? What about calf viability and calf performance? Could there be issues with colostrum quality? And then what is a very versatile snapshot of doing in a herd, if you want to assess whether Johne's is a risk or not, is looking at your cull animals, because if ever there's likely to be Johne's present in your herd, it's quite likely to show up in your cull animals. So if there are any animals that are worth testing as a bit of a look-see, then your cull animals will be the good ones to go for. In terms of the sort of diagnostic testing that can be done, then either fecal or blood samples collected by your vet are the way to go to actually prove what's going on and try and ascertain whether Johne's is an issue for this animal or not. And the aim of the diagnostic tests that we have is that we can not only diagnose clinical disease, but we can pick up some of the positive carriers before they actually go on to develop clinical disease and show problems. So if you're in a herd where you have Johne's and you know it's present, and again applies to a commercial situation as much as a pedigree one, how best do I manage that situation, and what are your options going forward to trying to reduce the risk? What I would say is that whatever you do, you've got to consider how this disease is spread in your herd. And like anything, you can remove positive animals, but if we're not acting to control the source of the infection and how that infection is spread within a herd, then we're always going to be up against problems. And it's quite a complicated slide, this, but very much the key of a lot of the Johne's problems that occur in herds surrounds the calving period, the late pregnancy stage, and how we manage where animals calve and the colostrum that we're giving them, because feces is the biggest risk of spread. Young calves are the most susceptible animals that are going to pick this disease up. So looking around the dry period, ensuring that the dry cow accommodation is as clean as possible. If there are any known Johne's positives within the herd group, that they are segregated and managed separately at calving. And if you're using colostrum and maybe sharing colostrum between different calves, that we ensure that no colostrum that's actually given to a calf comes from a cow that has Johne's disease. And these two things are absolutely critical at reducing the risk of spread within a herd. And if we can get these things right, and these things alone, then we can go some way to controlling the spread of this disease. Okay. Also, it helps in a herd situation to know which are your positive animals, or get a guide to which your positive animals are and which animals are negative. So approaching this by blood testing the whole herd or all animals over 2 years old on an annual basis allows you to pick up your positives and then gives you the tools and the information to manage these animals separately around calving and then ultimately remove these animals from the herd and not retain their offspring for breeding. So separate the test positives from the test negatives, particularly at calving, and then calve in isolation, rear the calf in isolation from a known positive. Don't put her back to the bull, and then hopefully remove this animal from the herd when she's still got a saleable value, and I'll maybe give you some example figures of that at the end. And one of the critical things, particularly with suckler herds, is not to retain the offspring of known positive cows as breeding animals within your herd. And there's maybe a few things we could discuss about that later on as well if people want to. one of the criticisms of Johne's disease from a veterinary point of view and a lab point of view is that the tests are poor. And my argument back would be, is it poor tests or a difficult disease? And we've touched on some of this already. But looking at this, if you've got the lifespan of an animal where they're born here, they mature here, and then they might develop clinical disease here, and you can see this poor animal here on the bottom right. If you let this disease really run its course, then you could end up with some emaciated animals that would ultimately die. And thankfully, we don't really allow animals to get to this stage through the sort of control programs that people have got on their farms. What we know also is that they shed increasing amounts of the organism in the feces as time goes on. So this time axis here is probably measured in years rather than months, so probably up to 5 or 6 years. And we know as they get older, the risk of them contaminating the environment and passing the infection on to their calves goes up. Okay? There are different tests that we can use and we can apply to the whole process, and the two main ones that we use are looking at the organisms in the feces, and we're more likely to pick that up at the clinical stages of the disease. The other tests that we use are looking for antibodies in the blood, and you can see also that we only start to pick these things up as the animal gets older and the disease process becomes more advanced. So we're going to not pick up all of the positive animals at a single blood test. It would be lovely if we could manage to achieve that, but we can't. However, if we repeat this process on an annual basis, we can pick up all the positives over time in herds, but it can take years to do this. There's no way around that. One of the critical things also is usually the animals go blood test positive, where we can pick things up before they start to excrete large amounts of the organism in the feces. So from a control point of view on farm, that can be a help in the whole process. So yes, it is a difficult disease. It's a long incubation period disease, and what we would really dearly love to have is tests that picked up the infection at a very, very, very early stage, so that you could decide what you do with these animals at that stage. And maybe in the future we'll get there. However, the tests that we have at the moment do work in a herd context and are pretty good at picking up clinical disease when it occurs and confirming the diagnosis. Now, I put this slide up as an example. Grange Farm is a real farm. It's not a made-up farm, and you can say, right, well, these figures are quite old now because they start in 2004 and go through to 2009. But this shows an example of how progress can be made in a herd over time, and it's a real farm example. So this was a herd that actually was destocked. It lost its stock in 2001 with foot and mouth. It restocked again after that, and it brought in Johne's disease at that stage. And from 2004 onwards, they set about an annual herd testing program in this herd, and they're still doing this now. So you can see at the start of the process, they had 5 positives and 2 inconclusives on the blood test. This is out of about between 130 and 150 animals a year being tested. And over time, that number has been whittled down by a combination of testing, removing the test positives, and dealing with all of the risk factors for spread on the farm, such that at the point in 2008, they got their first clear herd test. That was repeated again in 2009, and actually, real world situation, in 2010, they got 1 more positive again. So they nearly made it to being clear completely. They got 1 more positive again in 2010, and then since then, they've been completely negative ever since. So you could argue again, I put up a good example of how disease control for this disease can work and can work well, but it is an example of a real world situation where it has worked to show that it can. One of the incentives, I would say, for commercial producers in particular, but it could apply in any situation, is to justify the cost on this in terms of the value of your cull cows. And you can argue about the figures that I've put up here as to whether they're right or wrong, but they do illustrate a principle in that probably, let's say, for a really good quality beef suckler cow, leaving the herd as a cull cow might be worth a 4-figure sum, possibly, maybe not, depends on the situation. A poorer quality Johne's infected cow, thin, lean, you might get a couple of £100 for her, something like that, depends on circumstance. And if it dies, then you could be paying £100+ to get the thing taken away. And where a lot of commercial producers say that they get a benefit from the scheme is by being able to identify their positives early, be able to sell them when they still have some value attached to them, and the money that they make from that alone will pay for the cost of doing the testing. So there are all sorts of other advantages to it as well, but it can pay for itself quite readily in a herd where there is active Johne's disease occurring. So to finish with, my key messages would be, for any herd, is know what your potential Johne's status is and your potential risks are. That doesn't mean you necessarily have to engage in a full herd testing program, but know in combination with your vet whether this is a disease that you have in your herd, and consider the different clinical presentations that it can show up with. That's number one. Risk assess what you're doing in terms of breeding replacements, in terms of your calving program, how you're managing your young stock, so that if there is Johne's there, you can minimize the risk of onward spread. If you do have the disease present in your herd, then consider herd level testing as a control strategy to bring this disease under control, and discuss that one with your vet. And then reassess these control strategies over time to see how you need to adapt them going forward, because it is a long-term process managing Johne's disease, and it will involve, going back through it and reconsidering what's working and what's not over time. Okay, I think that's me. Thank you very much.